Marcus Williams had always known the weight of judgment. At 23, he carried himself with the careful precision of someone who understood that every movement, every word, every glance would be scrutinized and measured against assumptions that had nothing to do with who he really was. The courtroom that Tuesday morning felt like a fishbowl, with dozens of eyes tracking his every step as he walked toward the defendant's table. The charges were serious: armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and resisting arrest. The prosecution painted him as a dangerous criminal who had terrorized a convenience store owner and his customers on a rainy night in downtown Chicago. According to their version of events, Marcus had burst through the glass doors with a gun drawn, demanding money and threatening innocent people before leading police on a high-speed chase through residential neighborhoods. His public defender, Sarah Martinez, was young and overworked, handling 37 cases that month alone. She had maybe 15 minutes to spare for each client, barely enough time to learn their names, let alone understand the complexities of their situations. Marcus could see the exhaustion in her eyes as she shuffled through paperwork, occasionally glancing up at him with what might have been sympathy or resignation. The media had already convicted him in the court of public opinion. Local news stations ran his mugshot alongside dramatic headlines about rising crime rates and the dangers facing ordinary citizens. Social media buzzed with angry comments from people who had never met him but felt confident in their assessment of his character. Based on a single photograph and a handful of police statements, Marcus thought about his grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. She had worked 3 jobs to keep him in school and off the streets, always telling him that education and hard work would be his salvation. He had listened, earning a scholarship to community college and working part-time at a local garage while studying mechanical engineering. None of that seemed to matter now as he sat in an orange jumpsuit, watching potential jurors file into the courtroom. The prosecutor, District Attorney Robert Thompson, was a career politician with aspirations for higher office. He had built his reputation on tough-on-crime rhetoric and impressive conviction rates. During jury selection, he spoke passionately about the need to protect law-abiding citizens from dangerous predators who threatened the fabric of society. His words carried the weight of authority and righteousness that resonated with many in the community. As the days passed, Marcus watched the case unfold with growing desperation. Witness after witness took the stand to identify him as the perpetrator. The store owner, Mr. Chen, pointed directly at Marcus with a trembling hand, describing in vivid detail how the young man had terrorized his family and customers. Security camera footage was grainy and unclear, but the prosecution argued it clearly showed Marcus entering and leaving the store. The evidence seemed overwhelming and damning. Police officers testified about the chase, describing how the suspect had driven recklessly through school zones and residential areas, endangering countless innocent lives. They spoke of finding the weapon in the abandoned car and matching fingerprints that placed Marcus at the scene of the crime. Marcus tried to tell his side of the story during brief conversations with his attorney. He explained that he had been visiting his girlfriend across town that night, helping her move furniture for her elderly neighbor. He had receipts from a gas station 20 miles away, time-stamped during the exact time the robbery was taking place. But Sarah Martinez seemed overwhelmed by the prosecution's case and unsure how to effectively challenge their narrative. The young man watched as his character was systematically destroyed in front of a jury of 12 strangers. The prosecution portrayed him as exactly what the media had suggested: another young criminal from a broken home who had chosen violence and theft over honest work. They spoke of his juvenile record, minor infractions from his teenage years that had been sealed but somehow found their way into the proceedings. Friends and family members who might have testified on his behalf were afraid to get involved. Some had their own legal troubles and couldn't risk drawing attention from law enforcement. Others simply didn't want to be associated with such a high-profile case. Marcus understood their fear but felt increasingly isolated as the walls of justice seemed to close in around him. The prosecution's case appeared airtight, built on eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and a compelling narrative that fit neatly into preconceived notions about crime and punishment. As the trial progressed, even Marcus began to wonder if somehow he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, so many times that the universe itself had conspired against him. Sarah Martinez did her best with limited resources and time, but she was clearly outmatched by the prosecution's extensive preparation and resources. The case that should have been about seeking truth and justice had become a political theater, where Marcus was merely a prop in someone else's story about law and order in America. The prosecution's star witness was Officer David Patterson, a 15-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department with an impressive arrest record and several commendations for bravery. He took the stand with confidence, his uniform crisp and his testimony delivered with the authority that comes from years of courtroom experience. Patterson described the night of the robbery in meticulous detail, painting Marcus as a dangerous fugitive who had shown complete disregard for public safety. According to Patterson's testimony, he had been first on the scene after receiving the dispatch call about an armed robbery in progress. He described pursuing the suspect's vehicle through narrow residential streets, watching helplessly as the driver ran red lights and swerved around other cars. The chase had ended when the suspect abandoned his vehicle in an alley and fled on foot through a maze of apartment buildings and chain-link fences. Patterson testified that he had found Marcus hiding behind a dumpster 3 blocks from the abandoned car, sweating heavily and appearing agitated. The officer described how Marcus had initially given a false name and claimed to be walking home from work, despite being discovered in an area known for drug activity and gang violence. When backup arrived, they had searched the area and found a handgun that matched the description given by the store owner. The prosecutor walked Patterson through each detail of the arrest, emphasizing how Marcus had resisted when officers attempted to place him in handcuffs. Patterson described the suspect as combative and uncooperative, requiring 3 officers to safely secure him for transport. The testimony painted a picture of a career criminal who showed no remorse for his actions and no respect for law enforcement. During cross-examination, Sarah Martinez attempted to challenge Patterson's account, but her questions seemed unfocused and ineffective. She asked about lighting conditions during the chase and whether Patterson could positively identify the driver from his patrol car, but the officer's responses were confident and unwavering. He had 20/20 vision, excellent training in pursuit procedures, and clear recollection of the events despite the late hour and stressful circumstances. Marcus watched from the defendant's table as his fate seemed to be sealed by Patterson's authoritative testimony. The officer's words carried weight with the jury, who listened intently as he described the dangers that criminals like Marcus pose to their community. Patterson spoke about other cases he had worked, painting a broader picture of rising crime rates and the challenges facing law enforcement in protecting innocent citizens. The prosecution also called Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had processed the crime scene and collected evidence. She testified about finding Marcus's fingerprints on the store's front door and cash register, physical proof that seemed to definitively place him at the scene of the crime. Rodriguez described her methodology in collecting and analyzing the evidence, emphasizing the scientific precision that supported the prosecution's case. Under questioning, Rodriguez explained how fingerprint analysis worked and why the matches were conclusive. She had compared multiple points of identification and consulted with colleagues to verify her findings. The prosecution displayed enlarged photographs of the fingerprints on screens throughout the courtroom, showing clear similarities between the evidence collected at the scene and Marcus's booking prints. Marcus felt the weight of scientific evidence pressing down on him like a physical force. How could fingerprints lie? How could trained professionals be wrong about something so concrete and measurable? He began to question his own memory of that night, wondering if stress or trauma had somehow blocked out events that had actually occurred. The store owner, Mr. Chen, returned to the stand for additional testimony, this time bringing his teenage daughter who had been working the register during the robbery. Linda Chen was clearly nervous as she described hiding behind the counter while the gunman demanded money from her father. Her voice shook as she recounted the terror she had felt, watching her father comply with the robbers' demands while praying that neither of them would be hurt. Linda's testimony was particularly powerful because of her age and obvious sincerity. She described looking directly at the robber's face when he turned toward her hiding spot, making eye contact for several seconds that felt like hours. When the prosecutor asked if she could identify the person responsible, Linda raised a trembling hand and pointed directly at Marcus, stating with absolute certainty that he was the man who had terrorized her family. The emotional impact of her testimony was evident throughout the courtroom. Several jurors wiped away tears as Linda described nightmares and anxiety attacks she had experienced since the robbery. Her father testified about the impact on their business, explaining how regular customers had stopped coming and how the family lived in constant fear that the robber might return. As witness after witness took the stand, Marcus felt increasingly helpless. The prosecution had built what appeared to be an unshakable case, supported by eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and the credible testimony of experienced law enforcement officers. Even his own attorney seemed to believe that the best they could hope for was a plea bargain that might reduce his sentence. The media coverage continued to portray Marcus as guilty, with legal experts on television explaining why the prosecution's case was so strong and speculating about the length of his eventual prison sentence. Public opinion had crystallized around his guilt, making it nearly impossible for potential jurors to approach the case with truly open minds. Sarah Martinez knew she was fighting an uphill battle, but something about Marcus's case had begun to trouble her deeply. Despite her overwhelming caseload, she found herself staying late in the office, poring over police reports and witness statements, looking for inconsistencies that might create reasonable doubt. The young public defender had graduated law school with idealistic dreams of defending the innocent, and those dreams hadn't completely died despite 3 years of plea bargains and overcrowded courtrooms. The first crack in the prosecution's case came when Sarah discovered a timing discrepancy in the police reports. According to Officer Patterson's initial statement, he had arrived at the scene within 4 minutes of the dispatch call. However, the store's security system showed that the robbery had lasted only 90 seconds, and Mr. Chen had testified that he waited at least 2 minutes before calling 911. The mathematics didn't add up, but when Sarah raised this during cross-examination, Patterson explained that adrenaline and stress could affect people's perception of time. More troubling was the location where Marcus had allegedly been arrested. Sarah drove to the alley behind the apartment complex, measuring distances and timing routes on foot. Even running at full speed, it would have taken at least 8 minutes to reach the dumpster, where Patterson claimed to have found Marcus. The timeline was tight, but the prosecution argued that Marcus could have taken shortcuts through buildings or used the cover of darkness to move more quickly than Sarah's calculations suggested. The fingerprint evidence seemed unshakable until Sarah requested the original prints from the evidence locker. What she discovered made her heart race. The prints allegedly found on the store's door and register were remarkably clear and complete, showing none of the smudging or partial impressions typically found at crime scenes. When she consulted with an independent forensic expert, Dr. James Wilson, he raised concerns about the quality and placement of the prints. Dr. Wilson explained that fingerprints left during the stress and rapid movement of a robbery rarely showed such perfect clarity. The suspect would typically be wearing gloves or moving too quickly to leave such detailed impressions. More suspicious was the fact that the prints appeared to have been pressed firmly against the surfaces, rather than touched in passing during a hurried theft. Sarah's investigation revealed that Detective Rodriguez had been under pressure to solve a string of similar robberies that had plagued the neighborhood for months. The detective had received criticism from supervisors and the media for the department's inability to apprehend the perpetrator. Rodriguez's personnel file showed that she was facing a performance review and had been threatened with transfer to a less prestigious assignment if she didn't produce results. The defense attorney also discovered that Officer Patterson had been involved in several controversial arrests over the past 2 years. Internal Affairs had investigated complaints about his aggressive tactics and tendency to use excessive force during apprehensions. While Patterson had been cleared of wrongdoing in each case, the pattern suggested an officer who might be willing to bend rules to secure convictions. More concerning was Patterson's financial situation. Public records showed that he had recently gone through an expensive divorce and was facing foreclosure on his home. His ex-wife had filed complaints alleging that he had hidden assets and failed to pay court-ordered child support. The financial pressure might have motivated Patterson to seek overtime pay or commendations that could lead to promotion and salary increases. Sarah's breakthrough came when she tracked down security camera footage from a gas station 12 blocks from the crime scene. The timestamp showed Marcus purchasing coffee and snacks at the exact time the robbery was taking place. The footage clearly showed his face and clothing, which didn't match the description given by witnesses. More importantly, the receipt in Marcus's pocket, which the prosecution had dismissed as irrelevant, corroborated his alibi. The gas station attendant, Miguel Santos, remembered Marcus because he had helped an elderly customer who had fallen in the parking lot. Santos recalled the incident clearly because Marcus had waited with the woman until paramedics arrived, demonstrating kindness and concern that contradicted the prosecution's portrayal of him as a heartless criminal. The attendant was willing to testify, but he was undocumented and feared that appearing in court might draw unwanted attention from immigration authorities. Sarah also discovered that the real robber might have been caught on traffic cameras during his escape. The city had installed new surveillance equipment at major intersections, and footage from that night showed a vehicle matching the description leaving the area at high speed. The license plate was partially visible, and when Sarah ran the numbers, they led to a car registered to Tommy Kowalski, a repeat offender with a long history of armed robbery. Kowalski had been arrested 2 weeks after Marcus's trial began, caught in the act of robbing another convenience store using identical methods. His modus operandi matched the Chen family robbery perfectly, entering alone, using verbal threats rather than violence, and fleeing on foot after abandoning his vehicle. Most significantly, Kowalski bore a strong physical resemblance to Marcus, sharing similar height, build, and complexion. When Sarah attempted to present this new evidence to the court, the prosecution objected strenuously. District Attorney Thompson argued that the defense was attempting to introduce irrelevant information that would confuse the jury and delay proceedings. The judge, concerned about the trial's length and media attention, was reluctant to allow extensive new testimony that might require starting over with a new jury. The legal system's momentum seemed to be carrying Marcus toward conviction despite growing evidence of his innocence. Sarah realized that she needed something dramatic and undeniable to break through the prosecution's narrative and the judge's reluctance to consider alternative theories. The young attorney knew that Marcus's life hung in the balance, and traditional legal strategies might not be sufficient to overcome the combined weight of eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and public opinion that had already declared him guilty. Desperation drove Sarah Martinez to explore every possible avenue, including reaching out to Marcus's family for character witnesses who might testify on his behalf. What she discovered changed everything about how she viewed the case. Marcus's grandmother, Eleanor Williams, revealed that her grandson had been awarded a scholarship to study engineering specifically because of his volunteer work with at-risk youth in their neighborhood. Eleanor showed Sarah a box of letters and certificates that Marcus had earned through his community service. He had spent weekends teaching basic car maintenance to teenagers, helping them develop job skills while keeping them off the streets. Local church leaders and community organizers had written glowing recommendations, describing Marcus as exactly the kind of young man who gave hope for the future of their troubled neighborhood. More importantly, Eleanor revealed that Marcus had been accepted into a military engineering program that would have begun just 2 months after his arrest. He had passed all the background checks and psychological evaluations required for military service, earning high marks for character and integrity. The scholarship would have paid for his education while preparing him for a career as an officer in the Army Corps of Engineers. Sarah realized that the prosecution had painted a completely false picture of Marcus's character and aspirations. Rather than being a career criminal with no prospects, he was actually a young man who had overcome tremendous odds to build a promising future through education and service. The revelation made her question everything about the case and wonder how such a fundamental mischaracterization could have occurred. Her investigation into Marcus's background led to another shocking discovery. The fingerprints that had supposedly been found at the crime scene belonged to Marcus, but they had been taken from his military application paperwork. When young men applied for certain military programs, they were required to submit fingerprints for security clearance purposes. Those prints were supposed to be kept confidential and used only for background checks. Dr. Wilson's analysis confirmed Sarah's suspicions. The prints found at the crime scene showed characteristics consistent with being lifted from paper documents rather than pressed directly onto glass or metal surfaces. Someone with access to Marcus's military application had used his fingerprints to frame him for the robbery. The revelation suggested a conspiracy that went far beyond simple police misconduct. Sarah's investigation revealed that Detective Rodriguez had a brother who worked in the military recruitment office where Marcus had submitted his application. The connection seemed too coincidental to ignore, especially given the pressure Rodriguez was under to solve the robbery case. When Sarah attempted to interview Rodriguez's brother, she discovered that he had suddenly taken extended leave and left the state without providing a forwarding address. The defense attorney also uncovered evidence that Officer Patterson had been surveilling Marcus for weeks before the robbery occurred. Traffic camera footage showed Patterson's patrol car near Marcus's workplace and apartment on multiple occasions, suggesting that the arrest was premeditated rather than the result of Patterson responding to a dispatch call. The surveillance raised questions about why Marcus had been targeted and whether the robbery had been designed to frame him. Sarah's biggest breakthrough came when she discovered that the convenience store robbery was actually the culmination of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. Mr. Chen's business had been struggling financially, and he had recently increased his insurance coverage significantly. The robbery had allowed him to claim losses far exceeding what was actually stolen, providing a financial windfall that would save his failing business. Chen's daughter Linda had been coached to identify Marcus specifically because his photograph had been provided to her before the lineup. The emotional testimony about nightmares and anxiety attacks was genuine, but it resulted from guilt about participating in a fraud that had destroyed an innocent man's life, rather than trauma from the robbery itself. Linda had been promised that Marcus would only receive probation and community service, not realizing that the charges carried potential life imprisonment. The conspiracy involved at least 4 people: Detective Rodriguez, Officer Patterson, Mr. Chen, and Rodriguez's brother in the military recruitment office. Each had different motivations. Rodriguez needed to solve a high-profile case to save her career. Patterson needed overtime pay and commendations to address his financial problems. Chen needed insurance money to save his business, and Rodriguez's brother had been promised a share of the insurance payout. Sarah realized that proving the conspiracy would require evidence that might be difficult to obtain through normal legal channels. The conspirators had destroyed or hidden most physical evidence, and getting them to testify against each other would require immunity deals that the prosecutor was unlikely to approve. She needed something dramatic that would force the truth into the open and expose the elaborate frame-up. Her salvation came from an unexpected source: Miguel Santos, the gas station attendant who had witnessed Marcus helping the elderly woman during the time of the robbery. Despite his fears about immigration consequences, Santos had been following news coverage of the trial and was troubled by the injustice he was witnessing. He contacted Sarah through a church leader, offering to testify despite the personal risks involved. Santos not only could verify Marcus's alibi, but he had also recorded the incident on his personal phone because he was moved by Marcus's kindness toward the stranger. The video clearly showed Marcus's face and clothing, providing indisputable proof that he was 12 blocks away from the robbery at the exact time it occurred. More importantly, the timestamp on the video corresponded perfectly with cell phone tower records that tracked Marcus's location. Sarah knew that presenting Santos's testimony and video evidence would demolish the prosecution's case, but she also understood that the conspiracy would likely collapse once exposed. The challenge was getting the evidence admitted in court despite the prosecution's objections and the judge's apparent reluctance to consider information that contradicted the narrative that had dominated the trial. She needed an advocate with enough authority and credibility to force the court to hear the truth. The breakthrough Sarah needed came from the most unlikely source imaginable. General Patricia Hayes, a 4-star general in the United States Army, had been following Marcus's case because his military application had crossed her desk as part of a special recruitment program for promising young engineers from disadvantaged backgrounds. General Hayes had personally reviewed Marcus's file and had been impressed by his combination of academic achievement, community service, and personal character. When General Hayes learned about Marcus's arrest and the charges against him, she was initially shocked and disappointed. However, as she reviewed the case details, several elements struck her as inconsistent with everything she knew about the young man, who had earned such glowing recommendations from teachers community leaders, and military evaluators. Her 40 years of military experience had taught her to trust her instincts about character, and those instincts told her that something was fundamentally wrong with the prosecution's case. The general's concerns deepened when she discovered that Marcus's military fingerprints had somehow appeared as evidence in a civilian criminal case. Military recruitment files were supposed to be confidential and protected by multiple layers of security. The fact that those prints had found their way into a police evidence locker suggested either a serious breach of military security or deliberate misconduct by someone with authorized access. General Hayes launched her own investigation using resources available to military intelligence. What she discovered was a web of corruption that extended beyond the Marcus Williams case into a broader pattern of evidence, tampering, and fraudulent prosecutions. Detective Rodriguez had been accessing military personnel files through her brother for over 2 years, using them to frame innocent people for crimes they had not committed. The general's investigation revealed that at least 6 other young men had been falsely convicted, using evidence obtained from their military applications. The scheme had specifically targeted men from minority communities who had applied for military service, knowing that their backgrounds would make them believable suspects, and that they would likely receive inadequate legal representation. The racist assumptions underlying the conspiracy made General Hayes's blood boil with righteous anger. Literally, investigators working under General Hayes's direction had uncovered financial records showing payments from various sources to Rodriguez's brother, insurance companies, business owners seeking to file fraudulent claims, and even some corrupt prosecutors had paid for access to military fingerprint files. The scheme had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits while destroying the lives of innocent young men who had tried to serve their country. General Hayes realized that the corruption was so extensive that civilian law enforcement agencies could not be trusted to investigate themselves. She decided to take personal action, knowing that her intervention might be unprecedented but feeling that justice demanded extraordinary measures. The general's decision was influenced by her own background as the daughter of a civil rights activist who had fought against systemic racism in the 1960s. On the morning that closing arguments were scheduled to begin, General Hayes walked into the Chicago courthouse wearing her full dress uniform with 4 stars gleaming on her shoulders. Her presence caused an immediate sensation as court officers, attorneys, and spectators tried to understand why one of the most senior military officers in the United States had appeared at a routine criminal trial. The general requested an immediate meeting with the judge, prosecutor, and defense attorney. In chambers, she explained that Marcus Williams was the subject of a military security investigation and that evidence in the case had been obtained through illegal access to classified military files. She presented documentation showing that Marcus's fingerprints had been lifted from his confidential military application rather than collected at a crime scene. District Attorney Thompson was stunned by the allegations and initially tried to dismiss them as military interference in civilian law enforcement. However, General Hayes calmly explained that she had brought federal investigators with her, who were prepared to arrest Detective Rodriguez's brother for violating the Espionage Act and other federal laws related to unauthorized access to military records. The implications for everyone involved in the conspiracy were severe and far-reaching. The judge found himself facing an unprecedented situation. A 4-star general was essentially telling him that his courtroom was being used to perpetrate a fraud involving national security violations. The legal implications were staggering, and the political consequences of ignoring such a high-ranking military officer would be equally serious. Judge Morrison realized that he had no choice but to allow General Hayes to present her evidence. When court reconvened, the general took the stand as a witness for the defense. Her testimony was delivered with military precision and authority that commanded immediate respect from everyone in the courtroom. She explained Marcus's military application process, the security measures surrounding personnel files, and the impossibility of his fingerprints appearing at a crime scene through legitimate means. General Hayes testified that Marcus had been selected for an elite engineering program based on extensive background investigations that included interviews with dozens of people who knew him. Military investigators had found no evidence of criminal behavior, substance abuse, or character flaws that would disqualify him from service. The young man described in the military files bore no resemblance to the dangerous criminal portrayed by the prosecution. The general's presence in the courtroom had an electric effect on everyone present. Jurors sat forward in their chairs, hanging on every word from someone whose authority was unquestionable. Media coverage shifted dramatically as reporters realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in American legal history. The story was no longer about a routine robbery trial, but about military intervention to prevent a massive miscarriage of justice. As General Hayes continued her testimony, the prosecution's case began to crumble visibly. District Attorney Thompson's objections seemed petty and desperate compared to the calm authority of a four-star general presenting evidence of federal crimes. The jury could see that they were no longer dealing with competing narratives about a convenience store robbery, but with questions of national security and systemic corruption that reached far beyond their courtroom. The courtroom atmosphere became electric as General Hayes presented evidence that dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. She testified that military intelligence had discovered an extensive network of corruption involving stolen military records, fabricated evidence, and fraudulent insurance claims. The conspiracy had operated for over 2 years, destroying the lives of innocent young men while generating illegal profits for everyone involved. Federal investigators working under General Hayes's direction had obtained wiretaps and financial records showing the conspiracy in operation. Recorded conversations between Detective Rodriguez and her brother revealed detailed discussions about which military applicants would make suitable targets for frame-ups. They had specifically chosen young men from minority communities, knowing that racial bias would make their guilt seem more believable to juries, and that their families would lack resources for effective legal defense. The general's testimony revealed that Marcus Williams had been targeted specifically because his engineering scholarship represented a significant opportunity that someone wanted to destroy. The real mastermind behind the conspiracy was a competing applicant's father, a wealthy businessman who had paid Rodriguez and Patterson to eliminate Marcus from consideration for the military program. The scholarship was worth over $200,000 and would have led to a prestigious career as a military officer. As General Hayes spoke, Detective Rodriguez was being arrested by federal agents in the courthouse hallway. Her brother had already been taken into custody at his home, where investigators found boxes of stolen military files and evidence of dozens of fraudulent prosecutions. Officer Patterson was arrested at his precinct, where he was found attempting to destroy documents that linked him to the conspiracy. The general presented video evidence obtained from Miguel Santos, showing Marcus helping an elderly woman at the exact time the robbery was occurring 12 blocks away. Military investigators had enhanced the footage and verified its authenticity using advanced forensic techniques. The timestamp and location data proved conclusively that Marcus could not have committed the crime he was accused of. Mr. Chen and his daughter Linda were also arrested during the proceedings, charged with insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit perjury. Linda broke down in tears as she was led away in handcuffs, finally admitting that she had been coached to identify Marcus and that her emotional testimony about trauma was actually guilt over participating in the frame-up. The insurance company had already paid out over $50,000 based on fraudulent claims about losses from the robbery. General Hayes explained to the stunned courtroom that the military's investigation had been triggered by unusual patterns in recruitment files. Several promising young applicants had been arrested shortly after submitting their paperwork, and military intelligence had noticed that these arrests consistently involved fingerprint evidence that seemed too perfect to be authentic. The pattern had led to a comprehensive investigation that uncovered the extent of the corruption. The general's testimony revealed that the conspiracy had racist motivations beyond simple financial gain. Recorded conversations showed that the participants believed they were protecting military programs from what they called undesirable elements from inner-city communities. Their prejudice had blinded them to the character and potential of young men like Marcus, leading them to destroy lives based on assumptions about race and social class. District Attorney Thompson found himself in an impossible position as his star case collapsed in front of television cameras and packed galleries. The prosecutor realized that his political career was over, and that he might face criminal charges for his role in pursuing prosecutions based on fabricated evidence. His aggressive rhetoric about law and order had been revealed as persecution of the innocent, and public opinion was turning against him rapidly. Judge Morrison was forced to declare a mistrial and order Marcus's immediate release from custody. The judge apologized publicly for allowing the case to proceed despite warning signs that should have prompted closer scrutiny of the evidence. He announced that he would request a federal investigation into all cases involving Detective Rodriguez and Officer Patterson to identify other victims of the conspiracy. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse a free man, General Hayes personally apologized to him for the military's failure to protect his confidential information. She informed him that his scholarship was not only still available, but that the military was prepared to provide additional compensation for the injustice he had suffered. The general also promised that the military would implement new security measures to prevent similar violations in the future. The media coverage of General Hayes's intervention created a national sensation. Legal experts described her testimony as unprecedented in American judicial history, marking the first time a four-star general had personally intervened to prevent a wrongful conviction. Civil rights organizations praised her courage in exposing systemic racism within law enforcement, while military leaders supported her decision to protect the integrity of military recruitment processes. Marcus's exoneration triggered a wave of investigations into other cases involving the same corrupt officials. Over the following months, 17 wrongful convictions were overturned as federal investigators uncovered the full extent of the conspiracy. Dozens of innocent young men, primarily from minority communities, had their records cleared and received substantial compensation for the injustices they had suffered. The conspiracy's exposure led to significant reforms in how law enforcement agencies handle evidence and interact with military recruitment programs. New protocols were established to prevent unauthorized access to military files, and oversight mechanisms were created to detect patterns of suspicious evidence that might indicate corruption or misconduct. 6 months after his exoneration, Marcus Williams stood at attention in his dress uniform as General Hayes pinned second lieutenant bars on his shoulders during a ceremony at the Pentagon. The young man who had been labeled a dangerous criminal was now officially a commissioned officer in the United States Army Corps of Engineers, ready to begin a career dedicated to serving his country and protecting others from the injustices he had experienced. The ceremony was attended by dozens of other young men whose wrongful convictions had been overturned as a result of the investigation triggered by Marcus's case. Many of them had also received military scholarships or civilian compensation that allowed them to rebuild their lives and pursue the dreams that corruption had nearly destroyed. Their presence served as a powerful reminder of how many lives had been saved by General Hayes's courageous intervention. Marcus's grandmother Eleanor sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her grandson achieve the goals they had worked toward for so many years. She had never lost faith in his innocence, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming and the legal system appeared determined to convict him. Her pride in his character and achievements was matched only by her gratitude to the general who had risked her own career to seek justice. Sarah Martinez had been promoted to a supervisory position in the public defender's office, where she now led a special unit dedicated to investigating potential wrongful convictions. Her experience with Marcus's case had taught her to trust her instincts and question evidence that seemed too perfect or convenient. She had developed protocols that helped other overworked public defenders identify warning signs of corruption and misconduct that might have been overlooked in the past. The conspiracy trials had resulted in lengthy prison sentences for all the participants. Detective Rodriguez received 15 years for civil rights violations and evidence tampering, while Officer Patterson was sentenced to 12 years for his role in the frame-ups. Rodriguez's brother faced 20 years in federal prison for violating the Espionage Act and stealing classified military documents. Mr. Chen and his daughter received shorter sentences after cooperating with investigators and providing testimony against the other conspirators. District Attorney Robert Thompson's political career had ended in disgrace, and he faced multiple charges related to prosecutorial misconduct and civil rights violations. His aggressive pursuit of convictions regardless of actual guilt had been exposed as a cynical attempt to advance his own ambitions at the expense of innocent people's lives. The voters who had once supported his tough-on-crime rhetoric now saw him as the embodiment of everything wrong with the criminal justice System General Hayes had been awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for her role in exposing the conspiracy and protecting the integrity of military recruitment processes. However, she considered Marcus's successful completion of officer training to be a far greater honor than any medal or recognition she might receive. The general had demonstrated that true leadership sometimes required taking unprecedented action to defend principles of justice and equality. The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy's racist motivations were part of a broader pattern of discrimination within certain law enforcement agencies. Federal oversight and reform programs were implemented to address systemic bias and ensure that young people from all backgrounds could pursue military service without fear of being targeted for persecution. The changes included new training programs, oversight mechanisms, and accountability measures designed to prevent similar corruption. Marcus's case had become a landmark in civil rights law, cited in legal textbooks and used to train prosecutors about the dangers of pursuing convictions based on questionable evidence. Law schools across the country studied the case as an example of how racial bias could corrupt the justice system and how courage and integrity could expose even the most elaborate conspiracies. The story served as both a warning about injustice and an inspiration about the possibility of redemption. The real robber, Tommy Kowalski, had eventually been convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role in the original robbery and several other similar crimes. His arrest had provided additional confirmation of Marcus's innocence and helped prosecutors understand how the conspiracy had selected targets who resembled actual criminals. Kowalski's testimony about his own crimes had helped exonerate several other wrongfully convicted men. As Marcus began his military career, he carried with him a deep appreciation for the presumption of innocence and the importance of fighting for justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. His experience had taught him that character and integrity could overcome even the most determined efforts to destroy someone's reputation and future. The young officer was determined to use his position to protect others and ensure that the military maintained the highest standards of honor and fairness, though the story of Marcus Williams became a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been falsely accused or judged based on prejudice rather than facts. His transformation from suspected criminal to commissioned officer demonstrated that truth could eventually triumph over lies, and that courage and persistence could overcome even the most systematic efforts to deny justice. The four-star general who had walked into that courtroom had changed not just one young man's life, but had exposed a conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of dreams and restored faith in the possibility that powerful people would sometimes risk everything to do what was right.